So given that we live in a world that is so externally validating in terms of how we measure ourselves, our bank balance equals success, our job title equals prestige, our white picket fence equals the American dream, do you think that the Western world specifically, again, don't want to get into sort of faction denominations too much, but America, the UK, those that exist with the mindset that we do, does it promote or encourage narcissism in a way?
Yeah, I think very much. I think the way sort of our modern industrial capitalist urban society has evolved is that people who are narcissistic do better. So people who are narcissistic do better in urban environments where they don't know people because they're better at going out and meeting people. They tend to come from smaller families because they have a little more focus on themselves. They tend to be more competitive, so they do well competing for jobs. They do better in job interviews, so they're better at sort of, you know, high speed economies. If you're in a small town in northern England and everybody knows you since you were 5 years old, it's hard to be a big deal because you're like, I'm a big deal. And they're like, yeah, I remember when you were 6 and fell on your butt. So you can go to a big city and you can recreate yourself. So these cities are really good feeding grounds for narcissism. And I think our general culture, which is buy stuff to build an identity to get esteem on the internet, is, you know, that whole consumer capitalism is really good for narcissism. But what I didn't predict would happen, I thought, well, this is great. We're going to just throw everybody online, tell them they're legends, and they're all going to be kings of some online universe, and everyone will be happy. I thought we'd have this sort of great fantasy migration. But what happened is it became very, very competitive. So even though society's pulling for narcissism, what happens is some people are really good at it, the influencers, the professionals, and it leaves a lot of us feeling worse than we would have if we hadn't had the internet in the first place, we hadn't had modernity in the first place, because we're comparing ourselves to all these successful, good-looking people, and we're like, God, we're kind of just mediocre, average people. I feel terrible now for being just pretty good. So I don't think it's worked as well as I'd hoped. It hasn't made everybody happy.
So we've touched on it there, and it's probably as good a segue as any to speak on the obvious question that's probably on everyone's mind right now, which is, what role does social media play in, as you've coined yourself, the epidemic of narcissism in the modern world?
Yeah, it's, you know, when we first started looking at this, I mean, when I first looked at social media, it was like a fringe topic, and this is probably 15 years ago now. And what you find is social media is a really good social ground for grandiose narcissism. So when you look at Facebook and Twitter and WeChat, you look across the sites, people who are narcissistic have more friends or followers or connections. They do well on these sites. They're good at taking selfies without their shirt on. There's a lot of advantages to being narcissistic for social media. So it really pulls for narcissism. And what that means is that when any of us go on social media and we look at our phone, what we're going to see in our social graph or our social world is more narcissism than really is there, because narcissists are overrepresented on social media. So when we look at the world through the lens of social media, what we see is this narcissistic world. People are self-promoting, they're talking about themselves. And it's not necessarily like that. So we get a bit of a distorted view of how Americans or British are because of what we see on the internet versus what we see in real life. But yeah, social media is just a big grandiose narcissism is one of the primary drivers of making social media work. Humor, cat videos are part of it. Rage is part of it. You know, it's just rage bait and there's humor. But ego is just a huge part of the whole system.
So bear with me on this, because a lot of what you've described falls into some of the categories that I place myself in that whilst I'm an athlete in many ways, a lot of what I do is documented online on multiple platforms with the aim of trying to encourage others to experience the sort of journey that I've been on from a personal point of view, and that we have a proven track record of that being the case. But the nature of doing that means that I am almost encouraged to talk more specifically about myself rather than think in general terms. But I wouldn't consider myself a grandiose narcissist within the framework that you've referenced, because I'd like to think that deep down I'm a good and moral person. So how do I know whether I'm a narcissist or not is essentially the question, which is not actually something I had written down to ask in this conversation, but I feel it's something worth touching upon, because there might be people listening that feel the same as I do. But you've described so many things that cross over with my day-to-day that I thought, oh no, have I accidentally dug myself into a hole here?
Well, you've hit the problem. Is the way to get successful in the modern world is you have to put yourself out there, and you have to feed the algorithm. You have to put out content, and you have to do it reliably, and you have to link it to your own story and your own narrative so people feel a connection with you. So that's literally the job. So you have to reveal about yourself. You have to say, I'm a high status person. You have to do good things. Well, that is like, hey, narcissist, come over here. There's some cameras. You get to talk about yourself. So what happens is, yeah, people are narcissistic, love this, but everyone else has to do the same darn thing. I have to get on social media, talk about myself, tell people why I'm a big deal. Everybody has to do it. That's the job. It's really hard. So 3 things. One, I can tell you you're not that narcissistic just from talking to you for 5 seconds. I shouldn't share that because I tell people I can't judge, but I can. You're okay. Secondly, a lot of it is the motivation for doing it. And is part of that motivation putting good information out? Are you trying to build? Are you trying to make other people better? Because if you're focusing on making other people better, it's going to come back to you. There's a way to do it. It's kind of, win-win versus trying to extract status from people. And so if you're going in it more an extraction way, I don't see any way around it. This is actually something that Chris Williams mentioned that I thought was really a good point. Said if you want to be famous, at least have a thing you're doing that's in addition to be famous. So
it's where reality TV has completely distorted that status game, hasn't it? Because people are becoming famous for just being people rather than actually doing anything extraordinary.
So when I started studying this, I remember Paris Hilton. Paris Hilton was famous for being Paris Hilton. I thought this was just wild. And the Kardashians, when that whole phenomenon, there were people in the 70s like that and in the 30s like that. But really, this whole phenomenon of being famous for just being famous was, so interesting. But I think the idea of being really good at something, and you might get some attention for that, or you might not, but at least you love what you're doing and you're helping a niche community. I think that's a better approach than just going, hey, I want to be famous on the internet for nothing. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I don't know. People really want fame. I don't know why, because it doesn't pay you. And there's lots of disorders that go with fame. Hassle, you get body dysmorphia, you get narcissism, you have to worry about your appearance all the time, you're constantly worried about the status. Fame cycles used to be years, and now they're literally minutes or days you're famous for, so it's an impossible task. I wouldn't recommend it as my life goal for anyone.